time now, we're going to hear from a diverse panel of business leaders who will discuss many of the major trends that are driving CSR initiatives now. And we are fortunate to have a truly amazing group with us today. As we get set up at the table, I would like to invite our panelists to make their way up. I'm honored to introduce today our panel moderator, David Korngold, who is director of BSR New York. David leads BSR's financial services practice and works closely with BSR's sustainability management team. And in that capacity, he works with companies across sectors, advertising or advising on integrating sustainability into corporate strategy, investment management, and products and services. Joining David on the panel is Althea Erickson, who is head of global advocacy and policy at Etsy. In this role, she leads Etsy's public policy and government relations team, focusing on and advocating for policies that enable Etsy sellers to start and grow their creative businesses. Andre Foray is Global Director of Water Sustainability at Anheuser-Busch InBev. He leads the company's work on water stewardship, investing in projects like watershed protection in high-stress and ecologically vulnerable areas. And Jamie Martin, Executive Director of Global Sustainable Finance at Morgan Stanley. In this role, he focuses on the intersection of value and corporate responsibility, working to drive responsible investment through sustainability initiatives and global citizenship. There are many more details about our panelists in your kits, in their bios. I also want to remind you that in your kits, you have those index cards that we were passing around before. Take a look in your kits if you would like to write some questions down as our speakers speak. Our BBB staffers will be walking up and down, and you just have to indicate to them. They will take that card and they will bring it up to the panel afterwards. So now I'd like to hand it off to David Korngold, Director of BSR New York. David?
Great, thank you for the welcome, and a huge thanks to the Better Business Bureau for hosting everyone this morning. It's a terrific panel and a great audience today. I'd like to begin by getting a better sense of who's in that audience as we sort of come in and out. Just to start off with a show of hands, who here works at a company right now? Any kind of for-profit company? Great, most of you. And who here is from sort of the NGO academic side or nonprofit side? And sort of advisory to those groups? Any regulators out there? Anyone in charge of the subway? Okay. And show of hands on who's more sort of focused on the New York region? National? Global? Wow, cool, great mix. And then last question for the companies in the room. Would you say you're more, I'll give sort of two options here, kind of on the beginner kind of stages around CSR sustainability, a couple, and then some more advanced and integrated on sustainability. Okay. Well, it's always great to get a sense of who's out in the room, and thank you to Claire for a sense of who's up on the panel. We've got a great group here, and we'll be exploring a lot of different perspectives on sustainability. I do corporate sustainability related work every day, and so it's kind of the lens through which I view a lot of the world. I open up the Times Business section every morning, and I see corporate sustainability stories everywhere. You open up today, the stories are about floods disrupting river-going commerce. They're about electric vehicles. A bunch of articles today about big tech. It seems the only thing that people can agree on in DC is that we need to do something about big tech, whatever that means. About discrimination in the workplace, about lending, risky lending by non-bank institutions. These are the global happenings, the global trends that are shaping a lot of society, a lot of the markets, a lot of the private sector. On today's panel, what I'd like to do is work with these terrific panelists to connect those headlines to the bottom line and think about how those global societal trends are affecting businesses and what they can do about them. So we've got Jamie, Althea, and Andre, and I'll spend a few minutes with each of them in turn, and then we'll have some group discussion and open up for questions. I'm going to start actually with Jamie, please. So first of all, give us a quick sense of your background and your focus, the focus of your role.
Sure, thanks David, and good morning everyone. My name is Jamie Martin, and I work in the Global Sustainable Finance Group at Morgan Stanley. Essentially, we sit at the firm level and are basically tasked with driving the firm's sustainable investing strategy across the organization. So Morgan Stanley has three business lines. We have our institutional securities group, which is investment banking, capital markets, sales and trading, equity research. We have Morgan Stanley Investment Management, which is our asset management arm, and then Morgan Stanley Wealth Management, which is our network of nearly 16,000 financial advisors that are providing advice to individuals and families and smaller institutions to help them reach their goals and grow their wealth. And so we're a bit unique in that we sit across all those businesses and have a simple goal that's complex to carry out, but basically taking what Morgan Stanley is really good at in the capital markets, in asset management and wealth, and thinking very strategically about how to add a sustainable and impact investing lens to that, because we're seeing these trends around investors of all sizes and companies as well, and really trying to understand how sustainability is adding value across their operations.
Yeah, so let's unpack that last bit a little. So we have seen clearly an explosion of investor interest in ESG, sustainability, CSR, whatever you want to call it. What's driving this, and how is that manifesting for different parties in the sort of financial services space?
Yeah, absolutely. So our team is the brainpower behind something we call the Morgan Stanley Institute for Sustainable Investing. And one of the things the Institute does is goes out and surveys Morgan Stanley's main client constituencies around these trends to really get our kind of finger on the pulse of sustainable investing and how folks are thinking about it. And this is all publicly available information. It's available on our website. All these surveys are really designed to give the market the proof point around the drivers around sustainable investing. So we go out and we interview global asset owners, so these are insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, family offices, pensions, endowments, et cetera, on a global basis, asset owners, how they're thinking about sustainable investing. 84% of global asset owners are either currently implementing an ESG strategy today or thinking about doing it in the next 2 years. And 60% of that number has started this in the last 4 years. So this is one of the fastest growing areas of the capital markets today. And it's really being driven, I think, by another segment which we survey, which is individual investors. So we go out and we survey about 2,000 individual investors here in the US across demographics, wealth areas, and regions, as well as different wealth bands. And 75% of individual investors that we surveyed are interested in sustainable investing. That number, not surprisingly, jumps to 86% when you cut it by the millennial generation, who clearly believe that business has a responsibility to improve society in addition to creating shareholder value. And then finally, the last demographic that we interview is asset managers here in the US, so the ones that are creating products for all different investors to invest in. And 89% of asset managers are dedicating more resources towards driving sustainable investing strategies. They're waking up to the fact that this is going to be an asset gathering opportunity across their clients as well. And so I think connecting to some of the dots that Al was speaking to, companies are responding to this. They're waking up to the fact that they're being evaluated on their environmental, social, and governance information. And investors are becoming much smarter in how they're using that information as an input into their investment process to better identify risk and better identify opportunity. And there's lots of, I think, it's an interesting time, I'll say, in how ESG data is being evolved and how it's being used by investors. I think we're really in the early innings, but it's no longer a trend. It's something that's very much here to stay.
Yeah, so it's clear then that investors, asset owners, asset managers are looking for more information, asking for more data. What are they actually looking for in the data? What should companies be telling them?
Yeah, and I think this is where it gets quite interesting, right? So environmental, social, governance information is self-reported, often annual, unaudited information that a company is putting out to the market. through their sustainability report or through other investor communications. About 10 years ago, less than 15% of the S&P 500 was putting out an annual corporate sustainability report. That number has completely inverted. We're now today more than 85% of the companies in the S&P 500 put out a sustainability report. I know this is a trend that BSR witnesses firsthand. And these documents have evolved from being more of a marketing type story to really investor communication. So, and we see this firsthand at Morgan Stanley. Our team puts out Morgan Stanley's corporate sustainability report every year as well. And in the past few years, this is a document that now gets signed off by our CFO. It goes through a very rigorous internal review process. This is the first year we put out a SASB, or a Sustainable Accounting Standards Board aligned sustainability report, because we know that the investors that are examining Morgan Stanley are looking at this as a piece of information when they're evaluating our equity as well as our outstanding bonds. We think that increasingly investors they want to hear about how companies are addressing the material issues that matter for their specific company. You know, the ESG issues that affect an airline company are going to be very different than a consumer company, and so not all companies should be held to the same necessarily metrics based on what sector that they're in. So there's a lot of work around the market infrastructure that's being developed to make kind of the matchmaking between investors and companies a much more efficient process. I think from the corporate side, I think some of you might have experienced the pain, the kind of death by survey that's out there about responding to all the different inbound requests, whether about how you're interacting and telling your sustainability story. And I think companies are eager to understand how to navigate that, how to get credit for what they're doing today, and then also what are some of the things that they can really take action on going forward and really be playing offense and being proactive around their sustainability journey.
Great. The other sort of headline I see a lot coming out of the financial services sector is around sustainable financing, green bonds, ESG-linked lending, SDG-related financing. Tell us a bit about the state of play there and what that means for companies. I think sometimes it's easy to read the headline, okay, there's a lot of green bonds, I work at a company, how do I access that? How do I interface with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So green bonds and sustainability bonds are a relatively new financial innovation, but that are taking advantage of a relatively vanilla structure, I would say, which is the idea of going to the capital markets and issuing a bond and borrowing money using that format. And so green bonds, for those of you that don't know, are essentially a company or a multinational, a supranational, or a municipality issues a bond, but they earmark the use of proceeds for a very specific environmental or sustainable set of projects. And they basically commit to the investors that the money that they use or that they borrow is going to be used to finance these various initiatives. And so this started with the World Bank and the IFC. Now you're seeing big corporations issue green bonds. We've done big deals for Unilever, for Toyota, to Unilever to finance their healthy living initiative, Toyota to finance their electric car manufacturing facility. Starbucks has been a repeat issuer of what's called a sustainability bond, which combine both environmental and social related projects. So we've done multiple issuance for Starbucks to finance the way that they procure fair and cafe certified coffee. And then also borrow money to provide technical assistance to places like Rwanda and Peru where they're growing this coffee, so they can grow higher quality coffee. They get better pricing for that, which leads to better access to education, technology, healthcare, and all the various multiplier effects. And the most recent issuance that Starbucks did this year, they're also using it to finance the way they're going to retrofit some of their stores to be much more efficient and drive cost savings as well. And so investors gobble up green bonds. A lot of them have, really embraced this. But it's also interesting. We do a post-mortem analysis of all the green bonds that Morgan Stanley helps underwrite, and a little, rough numbers, but 50% really have no idea it's a green bond. They just like the credit, and it fits a spot in their portfolio, and they're allocating that way. But 50% do have a responsible investing mandate, and they're very excited to know exactly how the money that they're lending to the company and entity is being used in a sustainable fashion. And this is really proliferating. We're seeing blue bonds. We did the blue bond for the World Bank. We're also starting to see SDG-linked bonds as well, where a company can essentially borrow money and then trace the projects back to certain sustainable development goals as well. So I think that's something that's starting to gain traction as well.
So if I walk out of this room and I'm thinking, I work in sustainability at a company, we've got a good initiative here, we've got a good sort of program around sustainability that we think we can get financing for. Other than Morgan Stanley, what's my first call? Is it to Treasury, to CFO's office? How do I make this happen? How do I?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more amount of education that really needs to happen within an organization. And when we started, really engaging companies on this topic, Morgan Stanley's been a partner around innovation. And when we first started doing these meetings, we'd ask the treasurer and the chief sustainability officer to come to the meeting and talk about sustainable finance and how we might be able to help. And sometimes it felt like that was the first time the treasurer and the chief sustainability officer were actually meeting in that room. I think that's improved dramatically in the last few years. Companies are much more synced up on their strategy. It's not just a silo or a marketing activity about putting out a report that has people holding hands and solar panels and wind farms on the cover. It's a much more dynamic conversation. That being said, if you're a treasurer inside a publicly traded company, your job is essentially to borrow money at the lowest possible rate you possibly can. And green bonds, while they might, I think the jury's still out on whether or not that's gonna really be the case. I think some of the multi-issued issuers around green sustainability bonds are starting to see a slight pricing advantage. I think ultimately what I do witness on a first-hand basis when we help these companies do this is the halo effect that is created. All investors, whether you're an equity investor or fixed income investor, notice if a company issues a green bond, you're signaling to the market the commitment around sustainability that you're going to deliver over the life of the bond. So I think just making sure that people inside the organization understand what a green bond is, how it might be, perhaps more importantly, what it might not, what it's not. I think the list of fungible projects can be quite long, and there's quite a bit of flexibility in terms of what qualifies for a green bond. And I think there's been more and more examples of companies being innovative about this, and really trying to use this kind of exercise as a way to push the company forward, both from a financing standpoint and from a sustainability standpoint as well.
Great. Excellent. Okay, thank you for leading us off with some views from the financial markets, from investor perspectives. It's interesting, when we all grabbed our seats, it was kind of by happenstance, but you've all lined up exactly how I had the questions set up, and I moved them around last night, so you didn't even know that. So I'll move on now to Althea. First, maybe you can start off by telling us a bit about your role and your focus at Etsy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I lead advocacy and impact at Etsy. So on the advocacy side, I've been at Etsy for about 6 years, and since I joined, we didn't have a government relations team before I joined. We really viewed our government relations and advocacy work as a tool to advance our mission. So Etsy is an online marketplace for handmade and vintage goods. We host about 2.1 million entrepreneurs who sell goods on our platform, and almost all of them are women. So 87% of our sellers are women, and they're nearly all businesses of one working out of their homes. So they're the very, very smallest of micro businesses. And their needs and concerns tend to be very different from even a business of like 10 or 20 or 30. And so their concerns aren't really reflected even in sort of general small business policy. So when I joined, Etsy has always been a very mission-driven company. We decided to try to experiment with a different approach to public policy and really think about how can we almost build a membership organization within a for-profit company. Nobody was really representing the interests of our sellers, and yet they had real public policy challenges. So we have worked on all kinds of issues ranging from tax policy to net neutrality, and really have brought our sellers together to help them, enable them to use their voice and advocate on behalf of themselves for the public policies that will help them start and grow their businesses. And I think you're seeing many more businesses sort of take more political stands that are outside of kind of their narrow corporate self-interest, but that's an approach we've been taking for a long time. I also lead our social innovation work, which is sort of the other half of the advocacy work. So in areas where public policy doesn't help, but potentially programs do. Again, they're very much focused on creative entrepreneurship, building economic security for our sellers. I can talk about those as well. But I think sort of I know I wear like many hats, as I think many of us at small companies do. The last piece of my role is overseeing impact. And we do not have sort of a dedicated single CSR team or sustainability team. We sort of work on 3 pillars of impact: economic, social, and environmental. there are 3 goals that sit underneath that, and each of those goals is owned by an individual with an executive sponsor that's sort of embedded in that portion of the company that is responsible for executing on that work. So I own 2 of those goals, the advocacy goal and the social impact goal, or social innovation goal, sorry. But I also help to sort of coordinate and make sure there is an overarching strategy for that impact work and drive that forward in a holistic way, even though it's distributed throughout the company.
Great, and I love it. We've already gone from the largest asset owners in the world to micro entrepreneurs, so we're really covering the full range. So part of why I think it's great to have you on this panel is I talk with a lot of companies about sustainability, and whenever public policy comes up, the conversation goes like this. We're doing so much on sustainability, we're doing all this great work, and I say, great, let's talk about policy and advocacy. And it's sort of like, well, we can't really talk to those people. There's sort of this team in DC or this team in the state capitol that's doing their thing. They're focused on tax policy, they're focused on international trade policy, and it's so divorced from the sustainability and impact work. You've talked about this a little bit, but I'd like to dig in more on how you make that tie between impact and the business and policy, and with all of the competing priorities to bring to DC or to bring to the State House, how do you make sure to put sustainability on that agenda? How do you make that case?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, when I started at Etsy, frankly, we weren't facing many kind of like challenging regulatory issues, and to the extent that we were, there were much larger tech companies like Google and Facebook and others kind of fighting those fights. And so it felt like there was really a space for us to proactively focus on the small business issues, and that was a place where we had a unique perspective because we are close to our sellers and understand their challenges, and it's part of our business to understand those challenges. And also there was sort of an opening there for us to be a unique voice and actually have an impact, whereas on the tech policy stuff, it's SOPA, PIPA, and all those things, I felt like, they've got that. The world has changed dramatically. You mentioned that big tech is all over the headlines, and certainly many of the things that are being discussed in DC will impact Etsy. What we have done as those policy issues have emerged and the way that we're managing prioritization is we've actually formed these cross-functional working groups that bring together the business leads that are impacted with the policy folks, and we're trying to figure out for each of these issues, whether it's privacy or content moderation or trade, which is one that we've worked on for a long time because our sellers need to ship goods across borders. What does the business need, but also what is the mission-driven approach to this? What are the ways that a social purpose company can distinguish itself through its best practices in terms of what it does around privacy, content management, these issues, and then how can we advocate for that and potentially go even further than some of the bigger companies in this space. So for us, I think it's still an opportunity for differentiation and building a trusted brand with our sellers, and it's nicely integrated with the business needs and the policy needs. And then in terms of like, how do we prioritize in any given month? Well, we always work on the seller long-term campaign, but then as issues come and go, we try to jump in where we can, where we think we can be effective.
And I think your point is well taken around community building too, and leveraging that community among effectively suppliers, which don't quote me on the suppliers part, but on the platform sellers, I should say, and on the customers, and thinking about how you build that unique community and brand around it and advocate for it. Another thing we sort of have chatted about a little bit is around how that reflects very different labor models. We read in the headlines all the time about the gig economy, about different sort of approaches to employment. A lot of your sellers probably are doing their sales through Etsy as a micro enterprise, as a side business. How do you think about shifting labor models and advocating around that? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think for us, I mentioned that most of our sellers are micro businesses. They're businesses of one. They tend to be self-employed. For about 30%, they run their creative business full time. That's on and off Etsy. So you could imagine them selling at craft fairs and also into small boutiques or what have you, but also on Etsy. For the rest, it's supplemental income, but it's supplementing often other types of self-employment. So you could imagine, for example, a freelance graphic designer who also makes stationery or cards and sells them on Etsy, and she's combining income from multiple sources. I think the world is moving in this direction. Many more people are working independently. We'd call it the future of work. I think McKinsey estimates that 20 to 30% of the workforce works this way in the US and Europe. The estimates go up to 40 or 50%. Well, I think the numbers can be overblown, but they're still meaningful. And I think it is certainly true that more and more people are working outside of traditional employment. That is true for Etsy sellers. However, they are not usually the ones that policymakers are imagining when they're developing policies to try to address these changes. So by and large, an Uber driver, a Lyft driver, a handy house cleaner, those are the folks that they're thinking of. And what we try to work on and try to do is to say, look, our sellers, they're not selling their labor. They may not face the same kind of classification challenges that have dominated this debate so far. They certainly self-identify as business owners and are business owners. However, they face many of the same challenges when it comes to economic security. Many of them have not started saving for retirement. Many of them don't have sufficient savings to manage some kind of emergency crisis. They experience significant income volatility where they may earn quite a bit over the holiday season when lots of people are buying gifts, but then see their income plummet in January. And they need to figure out how to manage that. And so what we try to do is really focus on those economic security issues. We put out policy papers and then have worked to advocate for those in Congress and state legislatures, and really try to put the Etsy seller forefront in policymakers' mind, not just the Uber driver, because I think if we solve for the Uber driver, we may solve for them, and that is important, and we should do that, but we're not going to solve for all the sort of legitimately self-employed folks who are working this way, and more people are working this way, who really do need those kind of economic security supports in place.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I feel like if you take the headline-focused view of things, it's often about large companies at odds with labor who might not be working enough to trigger the threshold to get healthcare benefits, or who might be on sort of a gig economy approach. It sounds like you're really focusing on how to align the incentives among your seller partners and your business and how to grow that together.
Yeah, and I think recognizing that because just working very closely with our sellers, I think we have much more insight into what their day-to-day needs are, and so they are combining income from multiple sources. And I think if you start from that understanding, then you start to see that we need systems change that isn't about the particular employment relationship between an Uber driver and Uber, or Lyft driver and Lyft. What we actually need is a way for everybody to manage their benefits outside of the employer-based benefit system. We need a way for everybody to contribute from many sources of income into those benefits. And those require more universal changes at the higher public policy level than they do between an individual relationship between one company and one set of workers.
Great. I want to switch gears with you for one last question before we get to happy hour. But I want to talk briefly about shipping and logistics. I have a 1-year-old, which means I am a very avid user of shipping-based commerce. I do a lot of my retail shopping online, and it appears at my door, and I'm very happy about that. At the same time, I throw out all that cardboard, I think about all those carbon miles, and the sustainability part of me sheds a tear. You've been doing a lot around emissions and waste. Help us understand, how is Etsy addressing these kind of new logistics models, these new retail models? And in some ways, you don't really have to. So why are you doing that?
Right. So ecological sustainability has been a core part of Etsy since its founding, and we very early on set ambitious goals around being powered by 100% renewable energy and reducing our energy usage. All of these areas which we're just and moving towards zero waste, and we've just been ticking those off 1, 2, 3. But I think there is a limit, but how much you can do in terms of your operations as a small company, particularly when you think about the fact that Etsy employs, I don't know the exact number, so don't quote me, but roughly 800 to 900 people. But we support 2 million people, and so when you expand the way you think about the business outside of just the narrow operations to the marketplace that we enable, you start to understand that we can only go so far by addressing sort of our data center usage and the other areas that are within our direct control. And if you include shipping, when you look at our carbon footprint, shipping, the cost to ship goods from one person to another, even though we don't control that, that's buyers and sellers shipping goods to buyers, that's enormously more carbon that's going into the air. And so we made the decision this year to offset 100% of carbon emissions that are generated by shipments on Etsy. And That was a decision that our ecological sustainability team had been working on for a long time. We had a relatively new CEO. They presented all the data to him, and it turns out it was quite affordable, less than a penny a package. And so once he pressure tested the numbers several times, he said, "This is crazy. How could we afford not to do this?" And so I think we were one of the first e-commerce companies to do that. That's the beginning of the journey. We don't think carbon offsets is the whole thing, but it's something we can do immediately to address our carbon impact. And what we hope is that some of the larger players in the market can say, well, if Etsy can do this, then we certainly can do this too, so that it won't be just about what Etsy's doing, but also trying to encourage other folks, larger players in the e-commerce marketplace, which is growing so quickly, to follow that example.
Great. Okay, thank you. So we've talked a bit now about trends in financial services and among investors. We've talked a bit about kind of retail and commerce, new labor markets. Let's shift now to talk a little bit about food and agriculture and beverage. Andre, maybe you can kick us off by telling us a bit about your role and your focus.
Sure. So as the world's leading brewing company, we are really passionate about making a contribution to a better world through our products, through our brands, the way we do business, and the local communities where we operate. So beer is a relatively natural product, so actually we have a huge advantage if we get this right in terms of making a positive contribution. So we're probably better known in some of the circles here for some of our global brands, Budweiser, Stella Artois, and Corona, but we're really passionate about our local brands. So if you're in Brazil, you'll know us as Brahma. If you're in Zambia, you'll know us as Mosi. If you're in Mexico, you'll think of us as Modelo. So that's very important for us. Is we think globally, we have global coherence in the way we approach sustainability, but we act locally. And it's that combination, when we get it right in terms of acting locally at scale within a coherent framework, that's really powerful for us. So within the context of the SDGs, we identified 8 that are really important for us. Of course, they're all very important. And we identified 4 particular focus areas in which we think our business can make unique contributions. And that's agriculture, water, packaging, and climate and energy. Those are really important issues that we drive. We think we can make a big difference on that. Personally, I lead on water sustainability for the business. So probably the best job in the world, leading water for the world's leading brewing company. So I'm really passionate about my job, and I'm really keen to share with you a few of our thoughts today.
Terrific. So you've talked already a bit about kind of global and local. I enjoy a good beer. I enjoy a good bud. Where does that beer come from? I drink the bottle. It's in front of me. Talk to me about what that global supply chain looks like.
Yeah, I would say, so in the context of our theme today of global trends or mega trends, the first thing for us is we've always been good at focusing on our operations, the way we make beer, driving down efficiency in energy, operational footprint, and water use, etc. We're really pleased to be world leading in terms of some of those efficiency factors. And also our immediate downstream chain, so in terms of packaging, we already more than 40% of our beer is sold in returnable containers globally. That's very important for us. We have a commitment that the rest who are not sold in returnable containers must have majority recycled content. So that part of the business I think is well known, but I just want to emphasize it remains incredibly important for us as we go forward. And I think some of the post-consumer waste issues with consumers are becoming very more important. So that's very, very critical for us. But we've gained a lot of insight in the last few years in the importance of the upstream, so agriculture and water. So it's not a surprise that good quality water and quality ingredients are essential for good beer. So we're investing very heavily in agriculture, particularly in barley, which is our scale crop, but also in local operations. So for instance, in Uganda, Zambia, Tanzania, we've worked with local farmers to say maybe we can use local crops rather than importing barley, expensive barley using foreign exchange into those markets. Develop and grow local crops at scale. In Uganda, about 5,000 farmers. So using sorghum or cassava to build a local beer, which is more competitive, can then be produced cheap enough and also then induce people to get out of the illicit alcohol market. So for us, that's a holistic type of approach. So we've learned that focusing more on agriculture, it is challenging operating in so many different markets. But for us, it's important we invest in from the seeds, trying to grow more climate resilient seeds. For me, more important seeds that are drought resistant. Very important for us, helping the farmers that they can grow in changing and variable climates. A very strong program called Better Barley, Smart Barley, focusing on our farmers, helping them grow better in the conditions that they are, so helping them with efficiency on the farm, improving yield, but also looking at the environmental stewardship, which is very important for us, gathering the data, and then through best practice sharing between the farmers. Because in reality, that's how the farmers learn. If I walk onto that farm, I can have as much knowledge as I like. They just see you as an outsider. But you have two farmers who can compare, why did you get X yield or use so much water in the same conditions, with the same soil conditions as me, and you're more efficient, then they very quickly learn from each other. So that's very important for us. We focus a lot on water within agriculture, so helping farmers, so in the US, in Idaho region, working with low elevation sprinklers, so that you don't have so much water in the wind, literally drifting away, making sure that the application is clear. And by combining that with technology, so that in different soil conditions and different elevations, that if you understand the soil moisture and you apply exactly the right amount of water required for the crop, for the point in its growth cycle, you can save water by up to 40% on an irrigation crop. And you actually find that you have better yield and better quality in your barley that you find. We are learning that as smart as we're getting on the projects, and we're really proud of the impact, that may not always result in more water security. So the project is more successful, but if that water that we save is either just used by the farmer to expand or allocated to the next farmer, we actually have more efficient use of the water in the crop, so there's less water percolating down into the underground aquifer. So actually you might be driving water insecurity through very, very successful projects. So we know we have to think about this in an integrated way. It's not just about narrow engineering efficiency, but we're learning as we go along. We work very closely with WWF and with the Nature Conservancy, and we understand that we have to invest in the ecosystems, natural vegetation. In some parts of the world that means removing alien vegetation, but biodiversity and ecosystems upgrades very important in terms of securing the watersheds in terms of where we operate.
So I'm sure that climate change is either an implicit or explicit key feature in those conversations. Where does that play in? Who's paying attention to that? Are you modeling that? Is that a risk management issue? Is it a supply chain issue? How are you taking this global concern around climate change and bringing it inside your business, into your operations?
Yeah, it's interesting when you speak to farmers, they often say, no, I don't believe in climate change, but I now plant 2 weeks earlier than I did 5 years ago. So we avoid the debate in terms of what are your views on the issue. It's very clear that there's real impact on farms, the planting types, that not just total amount of rainfall, but when it rains is very important. So there's real impact. So what we have to do is help our farmers and our operations become more resilient. So we're investing in helping our farmers understand better the soil conditions, in terms of weather prediction, measuring the soil moisture, understanding soil health, and managing better farming going forward. So for us, it's a critical issue. It's part of our agricultural modeling. It's very much part of our operational modeling on water availability to our operations, which is critical. We have a very strong risk management model for our operations. We know exactly which sites are at risk. They each have to go through a very particular set of response strategies. The impact will be long term, but we know sometimes you can have a relatively short impact. In Cape Town recently, the city was under huge stress. And I want to give you two examples from that. The one was the brewery uses natural spring water, which is a fact. The brewery was built there 100 years ago, and slowly but surely got surrounded by the community. And the breweries always had a tradition of sharing the spring water in relatively small quantities with the local community. When that drought hit, immediately there were people saying, but surely they should stop brewing beer. But the local community said, no, they've been sharing water. It's not a problem. So that pressure was not on the facility. And the second one is we invested with the city of Cape Town in helping them, because we identified one of the most critical short-term issues is water being lost within the municipal system. So within helping them with fixing leaks, pressure management, they're saving 4.5 million litres a day through the joint project that we have with them. So it's a range of responses in terms of how the impact hits us. So whether it's in our operations, in our immediate community with the local authorities, or in our supply chain, in terms of how the impact manifests for us.
And then thinking about the consumer side, your brands are so well known locally and globally. How do you think about sustainability and corporate responsibility as part of that consumer engagement, that consumer marketing?
Yeah, so firstly, the really positive side. We've had a really great impact over the last year and a half. Budweiser focusing very much on renewable electricity. We have a global commitment to get to renewable on-site electricity of 100% by 2025. We're already producing enough renewable electricity in the US so that the brand is already manufactured with total renewable electricity. We just signed a deal last week, which was in the press, that will get the US to 100% by 2021, our operations. So that's about 50% for us globally. So Budweiser leads that for us, and our consumers have responded quite well. Stella Artois is very well known in terms of working with water.org, in terms of providing clean water access to people around the world. Apart from really good work, we already reach 1.7 million people with water access through this project. We can see the strength in the brand. So the brand purpose has been enhanced. Our consumers are understanding and valuing the brand better. And then Corona investing in cleaning up beaches, particularly plastic, and then recycling that. That's a very important issue for that brand in terms of healthy beaches, etc. And again, the consumers are very energized around it. So that's what I said, the positive part. We can really see that it drives sales, it drives brand strength if you get it right. But we're not sure that any of us, the broader community, have really cracked how do we get the consumers positive about this. So they might respond to a campaign, they might like a particular campaign, but I don't see them demanding change. And I think that's something we all need to work on together. How do we get consumers to demand that we do the right thing and not just reward us when we do the right thing?
Great, and maybe we'll come back to that as we talk a bit more about stakeholders as well. I want to pivot to some sort of crossover topics among the group and actually kind of lead really nicely into the first one I wanted to address around transparency. Andre, as you're telling these stories to consumers, to the market, there's a storytelling aspect, and you also talked about data. How do you think about telling a story with impact, with emotion, with consumer engagement, and also with data?
Yeah, we're a lot better at the data part than telling the stories, to be honest. So for us, that's very important. So if you want to tell a story, you must make sure that you have the data. So for instance, just an anecdotal example, the water.org campaign, which is focusing on selling chalices, and then also unpack sales, and then we calculate clearly how much money we give them, and they know the average spend that they have and how many people are affected. Once those numbers got in the public domain, we were challenged quite harshly and quite publicly in saying, can you justify those numbers? And if we didn't have, firstly, a credible partner, and secondly, a full audit trail in terms of that issue, we would have been blown out of the sky immediately. So that's very important for us. So on the carbon side, which is probably easier in the sense that you can equate a lot of measurement to carbon equivalent. So we have a value chain carbon model. So we understand the carbon impact of agriculture, of packaging, of manufacturing, of distribution, of refrigeration, end of use, very down to detail, and we manage that across the group. So that's very important for us. But then recently we invested in a BankQ, which is a relatively small enterprise working in making transparent for cassava farmers in Zambia in terms of if you use sophisticated AI technology, but that's applicable locally, how can you help them make sure that they have full transparency? So all of a sudden, they understand exactly not just how much they sold, what the price is, but the middlemen could no longer take shortcuts with them. So by providing that transparency and data integrity, that really help those 7,000 small-scale farmers.
Great. Can I just
Please.
build off that from the investor perspective? So I think you were asking, who are the key folks to engage if you go back to your organization around these topics. I think clearly, from the financing side, obviously Treasury, Office of the CFO. The other area I think definitely would be investor relations. So this is clearly, there's a storytelling element around any company and how they're communicating to their investors, and I think there's a real mix of both quantitative and qualitative approaches when it comes to sustainability. I think we're seeing IR as being part of these conversations that we're having around sustainable financing. Now, the knock on, I think, the ESG conversation previously from investor relations would be like, well, on the quarterly call or on our earnings call, we never get any questions on ESG, right? And if you're a sell-side research analyst, you got one question you get to ask. You're probably not going deep on what your irrigation systems in Idaho are on and how that's driving cost efficiencies in your supply chain. But I think companies are now being more proactive about this. They're putting ESG in their investor relations presentations proactively. They want to go out on the road and engage with ESG accounts, and we're helping doing some matchmaking there as well. And then, as I mentioned, some of these frameworks, GRI has been one that's been around for quite some time. I think the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board I mentioned is backed by Mary Shapiro and Michael Bloomberg, and I think companies are continuing to use that first as an internal process to kind of benchmark where they are, and then perhaps adopting that more holistically as well.
Yeah, and actually I wanted to just zero in on that for a moment. So you published a sort of SASB table in your report. I know SASB has been a big part of the conversations you've had with companies around investor views. What should people in the room think about SASB, and how should they be using it in affecting their corporate sustainability efforts internally?
Yeah, so I mean,
for reporting, for materiality.
Yeah, I mean, I think the impetus around SASB is just to give a common language and framework for investors to really compare on an apples-to-apples basis on how material ESG issues are driving value. And I think that's ultimately what investors want to hear for company is how a focus on sustainability is unlocking value over the long term. These are often, very long-term investing horizons. These are global sustainability trends. You're not going to be able to, solve these issues in a quarter or in a year. And so I think, SASB is designed to really focus on these issues of materiality. It's also been really created with both investors and companies giving input. Whereas I think before, a lot of these organizations were, operating a little bit in a vacuum and saying, here's kind of a pie in the sky. And what we can and put out to the market and hope people kind of adopt it. I think SASB has been very thoughtful about engaging both the corporate voice and the investor voice, and hopefully get to somewhere that's ultimately providing decision useful information for both sides of the equation.
Great, and maybe also a way to help cut through some survey fatigue by pointing to that. Althea, I'll turn to a question for you, and then questions from the audience. Transparency at Etsy is really fascinating to me in two ways. First of all, the reporting is really integrated, and second of all, you do a lot of transparency reporting that isn't sort of soft mandated. You've done a lot of transparency reporting around law enforcement requests for information and content takedowns. Tell us how you think about transparency and make those choices around integration and being really proactive.
Yeah, so for us, transparency is really about accountability. I think it does have a piece that ties into the investment strategy. Certainly, one thing I would say is this: for the first year, this year, Etsy did do an integrated report where we put our sustainability, our impact data, we call it, directly into our 10K and into our annual report, and we put the SASB table as well. And for us, I think what we found is once we did that, then we started getting a lot of calls from ESG investors. So then we did start getting those questions. So I would say that there is a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing. And I think once we did that, it's actually been quite a learning journey for our investor relations team to start to see, oh my God, I'm getting these calls from these people, and actually people do care about this. So I think that just has been really helpful from our point of view and our journey. It also is incredibly helpful both for holding ourselves accountable. So once we put data out there and we know we're going to put it out there the next year, it helps us to garner resources internally to get the work done because we know we're going to be reporting on it publicly. It also gives us a roadmap for where we need to improve. So certainly there is survey fatigue or what have you, but I know when we go through those surveys, we also say, oh my goodness, we hadn't even thought about it from this point of view. We got to go talk to this team about this thing that they may not have developed a strategy yet around. So that's also incredibly helpful. On the transparency piece, I think on the transparency report, we actually have a separate transparency report that discloses data around law enforcement requests, around IP takedowns, intellectual property takedowns, content management, and that has really grown over time. It evolved originally actually around controversy when the Edward Snowden thing happened, and there was a lot of controversy around what data were tech companies giving to the government, and technology companies started to disclose this, but very narrow amounts. And then as we've gotten more and more questions around, as these topics have moved more and more into the public debate, we've started to disclose more and more. And I think you will see that trend going forward of technology companies really sort of opening the curtain behind what's happening around content management and efforts to build a really a trusted marketplace, right? And that is core to our business. And putting that data out actually does help build trust in Etsy's marketplace, which ultimately is good for our bottom line.
Great, and it ties very nicely into the words over there on the BBB banner. Great, so I want to make sure we have some good time for questions from the audience. So are some of those coming up? Or? Thank you, great. This is a great question to start off with because I love good sort of how questions. This is for Althea. Can you tell us a bit about carbon offsets? Sort of what you see as the benefits of an offset-based approach, how you've gone out to find those offsets and vet them, and how that went from idea to execution.
Absolutely, I can give you a high level to that. As I said, we're not sort of a single siloed team. So the team that really drove that was our ecological sustainability team, which is based in another team. They were very thoughtful about the offset journey. They went out and found, I believe we found 3 particular projects. One is a solar farm in India, another is a wind farm in India, and a third is a car manufacturing plant that's working on a particular type of car part that we think is important because a lot of the logistics that we're enabling are moving goods via vehicles. So that was an area that team spent a lot of time vetting and really getting comfortable with like these are the offsets that are going to be right for us, and these are the projects that make sense given our priorities. So that was an area that the team spent a lot of time on. I think I will just also emphasize that for us, that was an action we could take right now, and it felt like something we could do immediately to address this challenge, but it is not our long-term plan. So we're also investing in public policy around carbon and looking for more global solutions. We're also working with the logistics industry directly to try to think about how can we build more renewables and electric vehicles into the infrastructure that moves Etsy goods around. So for us, that was a first step, not the final step. And I think that team is really invested in more systems thinking about how do we make a more sustainable e-commerce infrastructure more broadly.
Great, thank you. So first of all, lots of great questions, thank you. And sorry, because I know we're not going to get to all of them, but there's an interesting cluster of questions around engaging value chain partners. We've chatted a little bit about this, but Althea, you've got 2 million sellers to engage on sustainability and get them thinking and acting about sustainability, whether it's how they source their products, how they construct them and sell them on your platform. So we'd love to hear from you about how you think about sustainable products with your seller partners. Mm-hmm. And Andre, maybe also to then turn to you and talk a little bit about how you think about engaging your retail partners on sustainability or other value chain partners who might not see the world as you do.
Yeah, So that's a new area of work for us and one that we're just starting to think about. And the way that we're approaching it is really looking at, okay, well, what are the major categories of goods that are sold on Etsy and what do those supply chains look like? And are there ways that we can help enable our sellers to build more sustainability into their supply chains? I don't have an answer for you on what we're doing because as I said, I think we're that's the next frontier for us that we're looking at. But I think it is certainly a challenge with many, many micro businesses who may not even have access to, for example, many of the certification programs that exist. The barrier is too high. So we've also looked at or considered, and I think something we're exploring is, are there ways to sort of bring sellers together and create a more simple certification process for the materials that they use that makes that more within reach for them.
Yeah. So it's easier for us to engage with our direct suppliers. So we're better at engaging with those who supply us with glass and with cans in terms of driving recycled content, lightweighting the products, and capturing those as overall CO2 emission reductions. Downstream with retailers, I think it's newer for us. It's certainly part of our journey. There are some discussions with them in terms of logistics, whether we could do better in shared logistics, the types of refrigerants that we want them to use and allow them to use. So for us, that's a relatively new but very important part of going forward. So we're also seeing that there's more value going beyond what we put in our contracts. So we're quite strong in terms of driving quality and sustainability requirements through our contracts, but moving towards more collaboration, shared and open innovation with our suppliers and say, how do we find new solutions? Because, if we make a particular one-way glass bottle thinner and thinner and thinner, that's great. But it's still glass that ends up that needs to be recycled. So are there different ways of finding different ways of packaging beer into the future? So we're getting a lot more innovative and thinking more systemic about it.
Morgan Stanley, we're in the advice business. We're not necessarily making things, but I think, there is, I think a lot of, the word disruption is used a lot, and I think technology is obviously playing a big part in that as well. I think we're also thinking about ways to activate our business to kind of increase the impact. So we've done a lot of work with an organization that used to be called CFSI. They actually rebranded recently the Financial Health Network around this idea of financial wellness inside a corporation. And I think obviously if employees are experiencing challenges with managing their own wealth, and that can be very stressful and impact how they're operating at work on a day in and day out basis. And so I think kind of expanding the sustainability lens when you're thinking about a company around the sustainability initiatives at the corporate level, there are different kind of pools of capital and different levers to pull. I think on the financial wellness side, there's all kinds of new technology and fintech companies that are helping kind of with smoothing paychecks and giving folks access to credit and student loans as a benefit and paying off debt and things like that. Also within retirement plans. So retirement plans in aggregate are one of the biggest pools of capital here in the US, 401k, 401(b) plans, obviously very long-term by nature within a retirement plan. Very little penetration of sustainable investing options on a 401k menu. And so we've been working with a lot of our corporate retirement directors in our wealth management business to add sustainable investing or ESG funds onto the 401k menu. I think a lot of the companies I think Etsy's got that on your menu. Morgan Stanley has 2 funds ourselves, and we're seeing that as a way in terms of attracting and retaining next-gen talent, clearly believing around sustainable investing. We think it's a layup to offer that as a benefit as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. I've been in rooms of sustainability professionals where the question is, how many of you have your retirement accounts in a sustainable themed investment? And almost no hands go up. So it's important to vote with our dollars, and companies can play a role in helping to make that happen. So a cluster of great and important questions around issues of diversity and inclusion and representation, and I want to address some of that. So I might start off with Jamie, talk a bit about some of the investor action there, and then pivot to Althea and Andre to talk a bit about engaging underrepresented populations and communities of color in your work as well. Jamie, there's been a ton of activity in the investment side around this. Maybe you can give us some perspective on what the advocacy looks like or what the engagement looks like, and what companies should be doing to respond at the executive level as well as throughout the business.
Yeah, so I think next to kind of climate and environmental, this idea of thinking about an investment strategy using either a gender lens or a diversity and inclusion lens is the one that's kind of getting the most traction. I think there are a spectrum of approaches. I think just to give some color around the gender lens approach, I think increasingly investors, they want to understand how a company is thinking about inclusion, diversity within the entire context of the business strategy. Way back when a gender lens strategy was about essentially counting the women that were on the board, and if you were above 30%, you got included in the strategy. That has evolved, and I think it's much more about understanding how diversity and how benefits are creating an environment that is including all races, all genders, all people, et cetera. And so not just at the C-suite level, at the board level, at the senior management positions, investors really want to understand kind of where you are today and how you are approaching this on a going forward basis. I think there's also some fantastic proof points from the investor perspective. Our equity research team did some research around if a company does have above average gender diversity in all the senior decision-making components of the company, how that can actually lead to outperformance over 1, 3, 5, and 7-year periods compared to companies in their sector that would have below average gender diversity. But obviously, bringing in diversity of perspectives, it leads to innovation, it leads to more clearly articulating a business strategy that can create long-term shareholder value, and that also I think from a risk perspective, a lot of investors are paid lots of money to better quantify risk, and so that I think is also an emerging trend as well. And then within the diversity inclusion angle, a lot of action also in the asset management community on making sure that there are diverse perspectives in the decision-making process of actually making the investments and the allocations of the investment as well. So if you're in an investment committee or a CIO type context, making sure that we've got a holistic set of perspectives at the table as well. And so I think more asset owners are allocating towards managers that can emulate that as well. I think it's still very little penetration. There's some shocking statistics in the venture capital community on how little money goes outside, the Bay Area, Boston, and New York to people of color and women entrepreneurs. I think some funds are now raising some serious capital that are really just knocking those kind of historic kind of blinders off the charts.
Yeah. So great to hear some investor perspective about shining a spotlight on this topic and looking for more data. And frankly, I think we'll need some pretty radical change to achieve what we all want to achieve there, what I hope we all want to achieve there. Stepping away from the investor perspective, I know, Althea, I imagine you're working with sellers from all sorts of different communities, geographies. How do you think about understanding the needs and perspectives of people from different communities of underrepresented populations and making that part of the overall Etsy community and advocating for that? So I guess understanding the different concerns and the differentiated concerns as well as how to bring that together.
Yeah, so diversity and inclusion is a huge area of focus for us and sort of the main focus of our central pillar, our social impact pillar, and that it does, have an area that's really focused on the employee base, and I think that's super important for attracting and retaining talent, as well as running teams that are going to do great work. On the employee side, we're doing great on gender, less well on underrepresented minorities. I think on gender, the majority of our board executive team are women. More than 50, majority of employees are women, or it's about 50-50. And in our engineering and technical roles, it's about 30% women, which is not parity, but compared to the industry standard of, I think it's like 15 or 20%. So we're doing okay there, better, but we have a good amount of work to do around underrepresented minorities, and we're doing quite a bit around both recruiting and also creating an inclusive and welcoming culture inside of Etsy through our employee resource groups and others. On the community side, we have a whole nother impact goal that's around making Etsy a more inclusive and welcoming marketplace. What we find is, obviously I mentioned the gender ones are off the charts, 87% women. Around underrepresented minorities, our sellers are more likely to be African American and Hispanic than the general business ownership population, but the stats don't line up with the general population. So we have a good amount of work to do there. And we do a combination of things. Some focused in the product around really making the marketplace feel like a welcoming marketplace, so ensuring that we have a wide range of people and products represented. When you go to Etsy's, you feel like it's a place for you, and that that on particular holidays that appeal to different ethnic groups, we're highlighting those things like Cinco de Mayo or otherwise. And that's all an area that we have work to do. That's more on the marketing and product side. We also, through our social impact work, do a lot of work on the kind of systemic barriers to entrepreneurship. So we have a craft entrepreneurship program that we work, we do in partnership with different communities, mostly libraries, small business centers, sometimes public housing, where folks who have a particular craft or skill, but maybe not the entrepreneurial skills, can take this class and using Etsy as a learning lab can open an Etsy shop and start selling goods. We also have a program called Maker Cities where we invest in particular communities that want to double down on bringing underrepresented groups into their creative economy and supporting their growth at the local level.
Great. And then a question that came through for Andre otherwise is around sort of thinking about the how to address global themes as well as local concerns, and think about the global brand and the global initiatives versus different local contexts. So I might sort of synthesize that in some ways with the question around representation, diversity, and inclusion. How do you as a global brand think about having global priorities around engaging the workforce, engaging your supply chain, engaging your communities, as well as translating that and applying that in very different local contexts? As you said, from Brazil to Zambia, very different markets. So how do you think about those issues of engaging underrepresented communities locally and globally?
Yeah. So firstly on the brand, so we're clearly very strong on trying to drive issues around agriculture, water, packaging, sustainability, climate and energy as really important themes throughout the business. It's very important for us. We want our local brands to take that up too. But just as we can't force it into our global brands, you really have to create a sustainability framework and let the brands find it in terms of the brand integrity, the brand personality. If you just slap a sustainability sticker on, it's a great campaign, but it never sticks. The brand has to find it in its own purpose and its own meaning for it to become a multi-year value-adding campaign. The same we find the same with our local teams, and it's very important for us. We keep encouraging our teams to think about sustainability not just as those four focus things. They're very important, but things like human rights, diversity, inclusion, local issues are very important. So, for instance, in Peru, there's a brand that focuses a lot on women and local weaving traditional skills that are being neglected. And how does the brand focus on that? In El Salvador, the issue of violence and bringing people who are alienated by violence back into the local economy. In South Africa, focusing on local barley, local hops, local water. In Colombia, there's a brand looking at biodiversity. And those are for us as part of our sustainability strategy as those four big themes. So what's easier for us is to drive diversity and inclusion within the program. So if you're working in Zambia with local farmers, and you often quite lucky, 50% or 60% of them tend to be local women, then that's the easy part. So, but it's very important for us. We keep driving and tracking how do we promote that and making sure that it happens. Globally, the brewing industry has been a male bastion for many years, and we've done really good at keeping women out as employees and alienating them as consumers. So we start at a very low base, but it's a very, very important issue for us. So one of our previous executives said, before you start producing pink beer to impress women, why don't you just stop offending them with your advertising? You know? So we're really starting on a low base, but I don't want to make light of a very serious issue. So our board just appointed 3 women, which I think is a very strong and very positive step. Our representation at senior level in terms of gender is not strong, but the figures are public. We work on it very openly. It's on our management meetings all the time. When we get feedback, we look at it all the time. The board has decided not to put targets, but it's very clear the direction that they expect us to move in. So it's a very strong focus within the business, and something that we all take very seriously.
Great. I'm going to give the last question to Jamie here for a few minutes, and then I'll just have a quick moment to wrap up. A question came in about what all this means for small and medium-sized enterprises. I think it's an essential question because it's very easy for these conversations to go to mega companies. What kinds of sustainability efforts should be expected? Are investors expecting and looking for among small and medium-sized enterprises? How should they disclose that, especially in a different resource environment? Would love to hear any perspective you have on
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately a lot of this really comes down to being intentional, right? So being intentional both on your personal kind of footprint, the decisions you're making. I think as Val pointed out, consumers are paying attention to where their food's coming from, how efficient their cars are, how efficient their homes are, the brands that they're supporting, and we're seeing that trickle over to the investor behavior as well. And so I think as a small, medium-sized enterprise, well, maybe you're not being, evaluated or, essentially graded on a quarter-to-quarter basis the way a publicly traded company might be, but you can be very intentional on how you are messaging and delivering a product that is creating sustainable value. I think there are a host of ways to do that. The one obvious one would certainly be looking to becoming a certified B Corp. I think the Benefit Corporation is essentially a certification. Well, it's two things basically. It's a certification for a company to signal to consumers and report out on the sustainability kind of initiatives and basically activate its company to create benefit for all of its stakeholders. So for its consumers, its employees, its suppliers, as well as its shareholders. And then if you want to go a step further, you can look into the Public Benefit Corporation, which is basically a corporate certification, which gives you protection to run your business for the benefit of all your stakeholders. I think there's, the jury's still out on how that will evolve in a public market context, but that's certainly one step. The other thing, I think, if you're raising capital, would be to seek growth equity partners or venture capital partners that are being intentional about the companies that they're selecting for their portfolios around this idea of impact investing, and I think can be real partners in helping you to kind of think strategically on that journey. And then again, when you're thinking about all the different kind of pools of capital and all the different operations from an HR perspective, from a strategy perspective, I think there are so much work to be done around sustainability if you are intentional about it and if you can message that. And I think again it goes back to the question on who you should partner with regardless of the organization. Unless you're the leaders of your company are articulate around sustainability, it really can be a struggle for it to really kind of catch hold within the employee base. And I think again, Treasury, CFO, IR, key partners. But unless your CEO or your C-suite is talking about this and really talking the talk, walking the walk, it can kind of fall off the radar. So that would be another engagement. If you have an employee forum, an open forum, you have an opportunity to ask questions to the leader of your organization. Ask them what they're thinking about sustainability. I mean, again, I think the time is now for a smart answer on the topic.
Great. So with my last 60 seconds, I'll just summarize a few themes that stood out to me in connecting headlines to the bottom line. First is around thinking about impact on stakeholders. That as we see these global trends and we think about the effects that those are having on different populations, thinking about what that means for the stakeholders to your business, whether those are sellers on your platform, farmers and communities in which you operate, retirees and investors and pension holders. So thinking about the impacts of your business on stakeholders and managing that. Second, a shift from internal focused sustainability and CSR to external, and thinking about the impacts of your products and services, of your partnerships with NGOs, with value chain partners, with policymakers and engagement with policymakers, and looking outside the four walls at those impacts as well. Third, thinking about storytelling with data and credibility, and being able to tell that story and communicate to consumers and to policymakers, but backing it up, whether that's with SASB, whether that's through partnerships that Andre mentioned with credible NGOs, or integration of IR and sustainability priorities and transparency like Althea talked about. And finally, I'll add, I think what's striking to me is we have the intentions really well lined up, and I think we've got a lot of the kind of early stages of infrastructure to execute on those intentions and to hold people accountable. But we need a lot of action now. We need a lot of transparency to hold us all
accountable to those intentions. So this panel, terrific. Thank you so much for exploring such a diverse range of topics and bringing it all together. Thank you all for being here, and thanks again to our hosts.
Thank you, David. And the scope of this panel with the detail within, I was sitting there just soaking it all up. So thank you so much, all of you, for being our guests today. This is an excellent panel. Thank you.